There is a tax law the United States passed on the 3rd of March, 1791. It was the first federal tax ever laid on a product made inside the country. The product was whiskey. The law was written so that the smallest distillers paid more than twice as much per gallon as the largest, and it was payable in cash, in a region where cash barely existed. The men who refused to pay it were declared traitors. 13,000 troops marched against them. The president led the army in person, the only sitting president ever to do so, and he was, at his death 8 years later, the owner of the largest whiskey distillery in America. The rebellion is remembered as a small lesson about federal authority, a footnote between the Revolution and the first tests of the Constitution. That version is not wrong. It is incomplete. It leaves out the part that caused everything: a national debt of $54 million, a bond market that had already priced it, and a tax designed to move wealth from the one part of the country that had none to the part that held the paper. To understand what happened in the summer of 1794, you have to go back to the winter of 1790, to a rented house in New York, and to a 35-year-old Treasury Secretary with a plan. The house stood on Broadway, in New York, which was then the temporary capital of the United States. It was January of 1790, and inside the house, a small, intense man of 35 was writing a report that would run to thousands of words. Alexander Hamilton had been Secretary of the Treasury for 4 months. He had been born out of wedlock in the Caribbean, orphaned by the age of 13, and he had fought through the Revolution as Washington's aide-de-camp. He was now proposing to do what nobody in the new republic had dared: put the entire national debt on a paying footing, at full face value, and tax the country to do it. The numbers were in the report. The federal government owed $54,124,464.56, principal and arrears of interest. The states owed roughly another $25 million. Interest on the whole mass, at the rates then running, came to about $4.5 million a year. The new government's entire revenue, from customs and tonnage, was nowhere near enough to cover it, and the debt itself had collapsed. The certificates that had financed the Revolution traded at a fraction of their face value, in some cases a dime on the dollar. Men who had lent their savings to the cause had sold the paper for whatever it would bring. Other men had bought it. James Madison, the man who had drafted the Constitution, saw what was happening. He proposed that the government distinguish between the original holders of the debt and the speculators who had bought it at a discount. Pay the original holders in full, Madison argued, and the speculators at the market price. Hamilton refused. The report funded every certificate at par, payable to whoever held it. The distinction, Hamilton said, would destroy public credit. The effect was to hand a fortune to the men who had bought cheap paper and were now to be paid in full. Madison's proposal was defeated. Hamilton had a phrase for what he was building. In 1781, a decade before the tax, he had written to the financier Robert Morris that a national debt, if not excessive, would be a national blessing. He meant it literally. A debt that was funded, serviced, and trusted would bind the states together, give the government the means to act, and turn the country's creditors into its most loyal citizens. The phrase is often quoted. What is less often quoted is the sentence that follows from it, which was the point of the entire whiskey tax. The debt had to be serviced, and servicing it required revenue, and revenue required a tax that would actually be collected. The second half of the plan was assumption, the federal government taking over the debts of the states. This was the part that nearly killed the bill. States that had already paid down their debts refused to pay for states that had not, and Virginia resisted hardest. The deadlock broke in the summer of 1790, at a dinner between Hamilton, Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. The terms of the bargain were simple. Assumption would pass. In exchange, the permanent capital would move south. to the banks of the Potomac. The deal was struck. The debt was assumed. The capital would one day bear Washington's name. Now came the question of revenue. Hamilton needed cash to pay the interest, and the interest was the point. Pay it, and American securities would rise. The government would be able to borrow again. The whole machinery of national credit would turn. He proposed new duties on imported wines, teas, and coffee, and, for the first time, an excise on spirits distilled inside the United States. Congress passed the bill on the 3rd of March, 1791. To understand why this particular tax set the country on fire, you have to understand the place it fell on. West of the Alleghenies, in the valleys of the Monongahela and the Ohio, farmers grew grain, rye, corn, wheat. Grain could not easily be sold. It was bulky, it rotted, and there were no roads to carry it east, but grain could be turned into whiskey. A bushel of rye made about 2 gallons of spirits. Whiskey did not rot. Whiskey could be carried over the mountains on a pack horse, and it was worth more per pound than the grain it came from. On the frontier, whiskey was not a luxury. It was the cash crop, the medium of exchange, the thing a man used to pay his debts and settle his accounts, the one commodity he could turn into money. The distance tells part of the story. Philadelphia was 300 miles east, over mountains that turned to mud in spring. A wagon load of grain lost its entire value in the hauling. A keg of whiskey, carried on a horse, kept its worth, and its weight was small. The men of the Monongahela did not choose whiskey because they liked it. They chose it because it was the only thing they could sell. There was a second grievance underneath the first, and it was political. The 4 western counties of Pennsylvania, the counties of Washington, Allegheny, Fayette, and Westmoreland, sent a handful of representatives to the state legislature in Philadelphia, a body dominated by the eastern counties, which had more people and more votes. The Westerners had been taxed by that legislature for years, in land taxes and in the poll tax, and they had watched the money go east, to the cities they did not live in, for projects they did not use. The whiskey tax was not the first tax they had resented. It was the one that broke through, because it was the first one that came to their farms, measured their stills, and put a number on their labor. A man could resent a distant tax on paper. He could not resent a collector standing in his yard. The accepted account of the rebellion is that these farmers simply hated taxes, the way Americans had hated British taxes. That version is not wrong. It is incomplete. The farmers themselves were not radicals. They were men who had crossed the mountains for land, cleared it, built cabins, and watched the value of their labor drain away in a currency they did not have. Many of them had fought in the Revolution, and they had not fought, in their own telling, to be taxed by a distant government that gave them no voice in the decisions that mattered. The irony was not lost on them. They had gone to war over a tax on tea. Now their own government had laid a tax on whiskey. The memory that shaped Washington's answer was not the Revolution. It was Shays's rebellion. In the autumn of 1786, 8 years before the whiskey tax, farmers in western Massachusetts had risen against their own state government. The cause was not a tax on whiskey. It was debt. The war had left Massachusetts with a heavy burden. The state had taxed its farmers to pay it, and the farmers, who had no cash, were losing their land to foreclosure and their bodies to debtor's prison. A former Continental Army captain, named Daniel Shays, led them. They closed the courts, stopped the foreclosures, and marched on the federal arsenal at Springfield. The rebellion was put down, but the fear it left was permanent. Washington, watching from Mount Vernon, wrote that it showed the danger of a government too weak to protect its citizens. The Constitution itself was, in large part, an answer to Shays, a stronger federal government, with the power to tax and the power to raise armies. When the whiskey rebels of Pennsylvania raised their own flag and closed their own courts, Washington saw 1786 again. He did not see farmers. He saw the thing the Constitution had been written to prevent. The law arrived in this economy like a tax on wages. It set a duty of 6 to 18 cents a gallon, and it was written so that the big commercial distillers of the East, who ran their stills year-round at full capacity, paid the low end of the scale, while the small farmer, who ran his still a few weeks a year, paid the high end. A small still could instead pay a flat annual duty of 60 cents per gallon of its capacity, whether it ran or not. The tax was payable in cash, and the frontier had almost none. The man appointed to collect it in western Pennsylvania was John Neville, a general of the Revolution, who had built a fine brick house on a hill above the Monongahela and called it Bower Hill. The farmers who refused to pay found their names on his lists. Washington, the president, was a Virginia planter and a creditor. He had watched his own revolutionary securities lose most of their value, and he had seen them restored by Hamilton's funding system. He believed in the plan. He believed in the tax. And he believed, with the conviction of a man who had commanded an army, that a government which could not enforce its own laws was not a government. What was at stake looked different to each side. To Hamilton, the tax was the difference between a government that could borrow and a government that could not, between a nation and a failed experiment. To the farmer in the Monongahela Valley, it was the difference between keeping his land and losing it, in cash he did not have, to pay interest on a debt he had never contracted. Neither man could see the other's arithmetic. The rebellion is usually dated to 1794. It actually began in September of 1791, with a tax collector, a mob, and a barrel of tar. On the 6th of September, 1791, a tax collector named Robert Johnson was riding through Washington County, Pennsylvania, on his way to serve notices on distillers who had not registered their stills. He was seized by a gang of men in disguise. They stripped him, shaved his head, whipped him, and poured scalding tar over his body, then took his horse and left him to walk home. Johnson survived. He resigned his commission within weeks. The first act of the rebellion was not a battle. It was a tariff on the man who came to collect. The tax had been in force for 4 months. The pattern that followed was established in those first years, and it ran like clockwork. A collector arrived in a county. The farmers refused to register their stills, or registered them and refused to pay. The collector reported the resistance to the revenue supervisor in Philadelphia. The supervisor reported to Hamilton. Hamilton reported to Washington, and each time the federal government pressed, the frontier answered, with notices nailed to trees at night, signed with a name that was never a real man, Tom the Tinker. The notices warned that any man who took the collector's side would find his barn burned and his grain destroyed. The name was a fiction. The threat was not. Here is where the mechanism becomes visible, and it is worth slowing down for, because the shape of the tax is the shape of the grievance. The law of 1791 taxed spirits at a rate that ran from 6 cents to 18 cents a gallon, depending on proof. But the rate was not the real instrument. The real instrument was the choice the law handed to each distiller. A large commercial distiller, running his stills all year, could pay a small amount per gallon and stay in business. The more he produced, the less the tax cost him per unit. A small farmer, running his still a few weeks a year, could not reach those volumes, so he paid the higher rate, or else he paid a flat annual duty of 60 cents for every gallon of his still's capacity, whether it produced a single drop or not. The design was not an accident. Hamilton had written it that way, deliberately, and he had said so in his report. The small distiller would pay more per gallon than the large, because the large could absorb the cost, and the small could not. On paper, it was a revenue measure. Underneath, it was a transfer, from the men who could least afford cash, to the men who held the paper the cash was meant to pay. the money flowed east. That was the point of the whole architecture. The farmer's whiskey, converted to cash and handed to the collector, crossed the mountains in the form of banknotes and went into the treasury, and the treasury paid interest to the bondholders, and the bondholders were the merchants and financiers of the eastern cities and the creditor gentry of the south. The farmer never saw the connection. He saw the collector, and the collector's name, and the fact that the collector's salary was paid out of the tax he collected. The system was invisible to the man who paid it. It was entirely legible to the man who received it. The resistance organized itself, and here the story acquires its second named man. David Bradford was a lawyer and deputy attorney of Washington County, a man of education and standing, who had, by his own account, nothing to gain from the tax, and everything to gain from leading the men who hated it. He became the voice of the insurgency. He called meetings. He wrote resolutions. He argued, in public and in print, that the tax was unconstitutional, that it was a tax on the poor to enrich the rich, and that resistance was not rebellion, but the same defense of liberty the revolution had been fought for. The comparison was not his alone. It was the frontiers. Men who had fought the British over a tax on tea now heard themselves called traitors for resisting a tax on whiskey, and the inversion was not lost on them. For 3 years, the resistance was a war of notices and tar and refusal, and for 3 years it worked, because the tax could not be collected where the collectors would not go. Then, in 1794, the federal government changed its method. It decided to serve process on the distillers who had not registered, to compel them into court, and it sent the federal marshal, David Lennox, into the Monongahela country to do it. Lennox took with him the man who had been appointed to collect the tax, John Neville, the general of the Revolution, the owner of Bower Hill. On the 15th of July, 1794, the two men rode to the farm of William Miller to serve a writ. Shots were fired at them from the farmhouse. Neville and Lennox retreated, and the rebellion entered its second phase. The next day, an armed band surrounded Bower Hill and demanded that Neville surrender the marshal. Neville refused. On the 17th, a force of roughly 500 men, commanded by a militia major named James McFarland, attacked the house. The defenders inside included Neville's family and his enslaved servants, and the fight lasted through the day. McFarland was killed, shot, by some accounts, after the firing had supposedly stopped. The mob burned Bower Hill to the ground. Neville and his family escaped through the back. The house on the hill, the finest in the county, the symbol of the tax, was gone, and with it went the last pretense that this was a dispute about paperwork. McFarland was the rebellion's first casualty, and he was its most instructive one. He was not a radical. He was a militia officer, a revolutionary veteran, a man of standing in the county, who had led the attack because the men who had gathered trusted him. He died on the field at Bower Hill, and the men who had followed him buried him, and the rebellion had its martyr. The federal government, for its part, counted him as a traitor killed in the act of levying war. Both accounts were true of the same man, and neither side could see the others. That is the shape the whole rebellion took. Two versions of the same event, each internally consistent, each invisible to the other side. What happened next is the part of the story that is usually told fastest, and it is worth slowing down for, because it shows the size of the thing Washington was facing. The rebellion did not stop at one county. It spread. A meeting at Mingo Creek voted to attack the federal garrison at Fort Pitt, and then thought better of it. A crowd marched on Pittsburgh and demanded that the town's citizens swear allegiance to the cause. At a gathering at Parkinson's Ferry, the resistance drafted a manifesto and raised the question of secession from the United States. A moderate faction, led by a young Swiss-born politician named Albert Gallatin, argued the crowd back from the edge, and the secession resolution failed by a narrow margin. but the damage was done. The federal government had lost control of 4 counties of western Pennsylvania, and the loss was not secret. It was being reported in every newspaper in the country. Washington had to decide, and the decision was not simple. He had been president for 5 years. The country had no standing army to speak of, no money to raise one, and a constitution that was still being tested. If he did nothing, the tax would die and the message would travel to every frontier in the republic. The federal government could be defied. If he acted, he risked turning a tax protest into a civil war and handing the country's enemies abroad exactly the spectacle they wanted. He chose to act. On the 7th of August, 1794, he issued a proclamation. The resistance, he said, amounted to levying war against the United States. He ordered the insurgents to disperse, and he called up the militia of Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey, 13,000 men. The army assembled at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in the early autumn. Washington rode out to review it and to lead it in person, the only sitting president in American history to command troops in the field. He rode as far as Bedford, in the mountains, and then turned command over to the governor of Virginia, Henry Lee, and to Hamilton, who went with the army as a civilian, carrying a commission that gave him authority over the troops. The column that crossed the Alleghenies numbered in the thousands, an army larger than any the United States had fielded since the Revolution, marching against its own citizens. The rebels, confronted with a force they could not fight, did what insurgencies do when the arithmetic turns. They melted. Bradford fled on horseback toward the Ohio River and the safety of Spanish territory. The army found, in the words of one officer, a country that had emptied itself of resistance. The Great Rebellion, which had burned a general's house and defied the president, ended not with a battle, but with a march, and with the arrests that followed. By mid-November, the militia had taken about 150 prisoners. 20 were held for trial. The army marched them east, over the mountains, in chains, in winter, to Philadelphia, where they were imprisoned while the government decided what to do with them. And here the story arrives at its climax, which is not the burning of Bower Hill and not the march of the army. The climax is what happened to the men who had done the burning, and to the men who had ordered the march, and to the tax itself. Before the climax, the cost. The rebellion had been fought by men who owned almost nothing, and the cost of losing fell on them in the only currency they had. The men who marched east in chains left behind farms that had to be worked, harvests that had to be brought in, families that had to be fed through a winter, with the breadwinner gone. The army had quartered itself in the counties for weeks, eating the region's stores. The prisoners' neighbors, who had not been arrested, were left to explain themselves to a government that had already decided what they were. The rebellion had not made the frontier richer. It had made it poorer, and the men who had led it were the ones who could afford to leave. Bradford rode for the Ohio. The men who stayed paid. The trials were held in the City Hall in Philadelphia, in the same building where the Supreme Court sat. The prosecution was led by the United States District Attorney, William Rawle, and he argued a definition of treason that stretched the law to its breaking point, that combining to resist a federal law was itself levying war against the United States, and therefore treason, the one crime the Constitution defined with care, the one crime for which the penalty was death. Of the 20 prisoners, 10 were brought to trial. 2 were convicted. Their names were John Mitchell and Philip Vigol, and they were not the leaders of the rebellion. They were not Bradford, who had escaped. They were 2 men who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of them, by the government's own later admission, a simpleton, the other, insane. They were sentenced to be hanged. The sentence was never carried out. Washington pardoned them, and in 1795 he pardoned the rest of the prisoners still held or under indictment, in a general amnesty that closed the books on the rebellion. And this is where the record becomes worth reading closely, because of what it does not contain. The men who had burned Bower Hill were pardoned. The men who had tarred Robert Johnson were never found. David Bradford, the man who had organized the resistance, escaped to Spanish Louisiana, where he lived out his life beyond the reach of American law, and he was never pardoned, because he was never tried. He was the only rebel leader who was never forgiven, and the reason was not that he was the most guilty. It was that he was the only one the government could not catch. The tax, meanwhile, had done its work. It had paid interest on the funded debt, and the funded debt had made the government creditworthy, and the creditworthy government had become the thing Hamilton had designed it to be, a state that could borrow. The cost of the suppression tells the rest of the story in 2 figures. The expedition that crushed the rebellion cost more than $1 million. The whiskey tax, in the years it ran, never came close to paying for the army that was sent to enforce it. The rebellion was suppressed at a loss, by a government that could afford the loss, because the loss was the point. The point was not the money. The point was the demonstration, and the demonstration was the thing the bond market had been waiting for. The new government would use force to collect its taxes, and therefore its bonds were safe. Washington, meanwhile, had drawn his own conclusion, and it was not the one the rebels had hoped for. He had seen the rebellion as a threat to the Union, and he had answered it with the army. But he had also seen the tax for what it was, and in 1797, the year he left the presidency, he built a distillery at Mount Vernon, on the Potomac, and put a Scottish manager named James Anderson in charge of it. By 1799, the year of his death, the distillery was producing nearly 11,000 gallons of whiskey a year, worth about $7,500, and it was the largest distillery in America. The man who had marched an army to collect the whiskey tax was, at the end of his life, the largest whiskey distiller in the country. He paid the tax on his own product, like everyone else, and he made money doing it. The rebellion had not changed the tax. It had changed nothing, except the demonstration of who held the power, and the demonstration held. The whiskey tax survived the rebellion, survived the pardon, survived Washington, and ran on through the administrations that followed, until Thomas Jefferson, who had opposed it from the start, repealed it in 1802. But the architecture Hamilton had built did not die with the tax. The funded debt remained. The assumption remained. The machinery of federal credit remained, and the excise itself returned within a decade, when the War of 1812 needed money, and the federal government reached, again, for the tax on spirits. The excise on distilled spirits has run, with interruptions, from 1791 to this day. It is the oldest continuous tax in American history, and it is still there, in the price of every bottle. The structure has not only survived, it has been reaffirmed. The federal excise on distilled spirits today stands at $13.50 per proof gallon, with a reduced rate for the first 100,000 gallons. In 2025, Congress made that reduced rate permanent, in a tax bill that cut the rate on the first 100,000 proof gallons by 80%, from $13.50 to $2.70. The tiered rate is the same architecture Hamilton designed in 1791, a lower rate for the largest producers, who can absorb the cost, and a higher effective rate for the small ones, who cannot. The small distiller of the 21st century pays more per gallon than the large, exactly as the small farmer of the Monongahela did in 1791. The names have changed. The shape has not. The argument over who the tax is for is still being made, in the same terms, 230 years later, and it is still being resolved the same way. The excise was the first federal tax on a product made inside the country, and it established the precedent that the federal government could tax domestic production at all. That precedent is the quiet parent of everything that came after. When the Civil War needed money, the federal government reached for a new instrument, the income tax, in 1861, and let it lapse after the war. When the 20th century needed more, it reached again, and in 1913, the 16th Amendment made the income tax permanent. The whiskey tax was repealed in 1802, but the thing it proved, that the federal government could reach past the customs house into the farms and workshops of the country and tax what it found there, is the foundation of the modern federal budget. The rebels lost the argument over the whiskey tax in 1794. The argument itself was never over. It is the argument over every federal tax that has followed, and it is still being settled in the same direction 2 centuries later. The rebellion, then, was never really about whiskey. It was about the invention of the American fiscal state, a government that could borrow, a government that would tax, a government that would send an army to collect, and a government whose bonds were therefore worth holding. The men who marched against the tax lost, and their loss built the thing they were marching against. The men who designed the tax won, and their win built the country the rebels had wanted to live in. Both things were true at once, and that is the part of the story that the standard account leaves out. There is a question the rebellion asks that has never been answered, and it is worth holding on to, because it is still being asked. A government that funds itself by taxing the part of its territory that has the least cash, to pay interest to the part that holds the paper, does not need to be tyrannical to be resented. It only needs to be legible. The Monongahela farmers could not read Hamilton's report. They could read the collector's face, and the distance between those two documents, the report and the face, is where the rebellion was born, and where it is born again, every time a tax falls on the people who can least afford to see it coming. The whiskey tax was repealed in 1802, but the pattern it set was not. Every war since has been funded the same way, by borrowing and by taxing, and every borrowing has been serviced by a tax that falls somewhere. The question of who pays is never the question the bond market asks. The bond market asks only whether the tax will be collected. That is the inheritance of the rebellion, and it is not a footnote. It is the operating system of the country the rebels were trying to build, and of the country they actually built instead. To understand what the rebellion built, you have to understand what it cost, and the cost was not counted in dollars. It was counted in the thing the rebels had crossed the mountains to find, the belief that a man's labor was his own, and that no distant government could tax it without his consent. The rebellion lost that argument in 1794, and the country has been arguing it ever since. The argument is not about whiskey. It never was. It is about whether the people who pay for the state get to decide what the state is for. The Monongahela farmers lost that argument, and the proof of their loss is that the tax they died resisting is still on the bottle, 230 years later, and that the federal government still sends its collectors, and that the question of who the tax is for is still not asked, and still not answered. The rebellion is taught as the moment the federal government proved it could enforce its own laws. That version is true. It is also the moment the federal government proved it would enforce its laws on the people who could least afford them, in order to pay the people who could most afford to wait. The two sentences describe the same event. The standard account tells the first, the record contains the second. The rebellion did not end in 1794. It is still running, in the structure of every federal budget, in the price of every taxed good, in the distance between the report and the face. The men who marched against the tax are gone. The architecture they marched against is not. That is the whole story, and it is the part that is never told. If you have stayed with this to the end, you now hold a version of the whiskey rebellion that is heavier than the one taught in school. You know the tax was not a mistake and not an accident. You know it was designed by a named man in a named report to do exactly what it did. You know the rebellion was suppressed at a loss by a government that could afford the loss, because the demonstration was the product, and you know the architecture survived the tax and is still running. That is a lens, and you can test it tomorrow on any headline about taxes, or debt, or who pays for the state. Ask the question the Monongahela farmers asked, and watch how rarely it is answered. If this kind of history, the financial layer beneath the headline, the architecture beneath the event, is what you want more of, leave a word in the comments. The word is still. And if you want the next one, the story of how the next tax was built, and who designed it, and who paid for it, subscribe. These histories take weeks of reading to assemble, and your support is what makes them possible. The record is long. The architecture is still running. Thank you for reading it with me.